Welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. Today we are continuing the Value Engine series and we are going to talk about some Temur decks. This isn't going to be a video where I tell you the best value engines like Ristic Studies and the Great Hinge. This is going to be a video where I talk about a lot of cards that if you put 3 of them together, they create this crazy value engine that can result in you drawing your entire library. So again, we're talking about multiple cards put together to create an insane synergy that allows you to eventually win the game. So let's click on that one link, claim our free $15, get 10% off all of our Tolarian library proxies, and then we can get right into it. I'm not sponsored with Baron of Dice. This means you guys can get 5% off whenever you guys use the code DT4D or click the link in the description down below. I'm a huge fan of the awesome art on their deck boxes and just the way they look in general, and you can pair up those awesome deck boxes with high quality playmats that match those deck boxes. Thank you, Baron of Dice, for sponsoring this channel. I want to start this video out by saying Temur can literally do anything. Temur does artifacts, Temur does Spellslinger, Temur does creatures. You can literally have a Temur deck be whatever you want, and the commander is going to largely decide what that focus is going to be. Because Temur can do everything, and so I don't repeat myself a ton when I talk about these value engines, if you guys are looking for artifact specific based value engines or Spellslinger specific based value engines, I will refer you to the Jeskai value engines list. I talk about a lot of, again, Spellslinger stuff and artifact based value engines there, so you can implement a lot of that into your Temur decks. But for now, let's talk about Temur and let's get aggro right out of the gate. The first cards I want to talk about are Toski and Oran Frostfang. Both of these allow us to draw cards whenever our creatures deal combat damage, and Oran Frostfang is even going to give our creatures Death Touch, adding to the aggressive aspect of this strategy, and Toski's indestructible, so he's really hard to get rid of. Now what you want to do after you get your card draw engine on the battlefield, you need to do that repeatedly, and I'm talking about extra combat steps. Extra combat steps are going to layer with Temur in a lot of different ways, but what you really want them to do is untap your mana dorks while they're untapping your creatures that are dealing combat damage. So let's say you have Selvala, Heart of the Wilds on the battlefield, a creature that allows you to tap for mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, and then you layer the deck with extra combat steps that untap all of your creatures. That's a value engine that is going to absolutely smash your opponents. And let me say this, all extra combat steps were not made the same. Let's talk about the best ones and talk about why they're the best. Savage Beating. This is a 5 CMC instant that says cast this spell only during your turn and only during combat. Choose one, creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn, or untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. And then it has Entwine too, so we can do both of those at the same time. Now, if you noticed what I said there, it says untap all creatures you control, not all creatures that attack this turn. And that's the wording that you want to look for when you're shoving it in your Temur decks that run a lot of mana dorks, because we want to untap those mana dorks at the same time when we untap all of our creatures that are dealing combat damage. Great Train Heist, let's look at it. It says untap all creatures you control. If it's your combat phase, there is an additional combat phase after this phase. So again, we're untapping all creatures, not just the creatures that attacked. Grim Reaper's Sprint does the same thing. It untaps all creatures, and it's an artifact. It also has Morbid, so you can cast this for 2 mana. Absolutely insane. I think this one's honestly underplayed. And then, you know, we have Aggravated Assault. Aggravated Assault is not okay because once you have a creature that taps for 5 mana, that does just go infinite. So it's not the most fun to put in a deck because it goes infinite so easily, but I did want to mention it because it does untap all creatures you control, and that's kind of what I was talking about. I did also want to end on a new card. We have Starwinder. Starwinder is a 7 CMC creature Leviathan that says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw that many cards. So it's Toski or Frostfang on steroids, and it's a 7/7. It also has Warp 4, so you can warp it in for a lower CMC and kind of get value before you have to spend that 7 mana, right? Couple things I like about this. 1, it's a creature, so it's harder to counter. 2, it's a May ability, so you don't deck yourself, because let's be honest, you could deck yourself with this guy. And then 3, it's a giant creature, and we want to play these giant creatures that give us a ton of card advantage in these Temur's lists. So, just to recap, extra combat steps, creatures that give you cards on combat damage, and then mana dorks that tap for a ton of mana will generate a huge value engine that leads to you winning the game. And just keep in mind, if you're building for this strategy, you need to ensure that the redundancy is there. You need a redundant amount of card advantage pieces, a redundant amount of extra combat steps, and a redundant amount of creatures that tap for mana. Now, let's move on to my next favorite value engine in the Temur category, and this is straight up called Creature Storm, and we'll see why I call it that. The first card on this list is Animar, Soul of the Elements. This guy costs Temur, and then he says protection from white and from black. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you get to put a 1/1 counter on Animar, and then creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each 1/1 counter on him. So eventually, you're going to get to where you're only paying the pips to cast your creature spells. Then we have Temur Battle Carrier. This guy works for all spells. It says during your turn, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Notably, this works with your Spellslingers decks. Throw it in there, especially if your commander's 4 power, because Temur Battle Carrier is also 4 power. So out of the gate, 3 mana reducing all of your spells by 2 is broken. Speaking of reducing spells by 2, we are also on Goreclaw. Goreclaw is a creature, and it says creatures with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. And that is the caveat of this strategy. You want to be playing a decent amount of creatures that are above 3 power, 4 power if I'm really being picky, because it ups the amount of cards we're able to use if we're talking about 4 power instead of just 3. That's kind of a qualifier here. It's not super important, but it will take the value engine to the next level. And the reason that is because there's a lot of cards that allow you to draw cards whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield. Temur Ascendancy says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, power 4 or greater, draw a card. It also gives all creatures haste, which is very notable. Gorik's Uprising does the same thing and gives your creatures trample, but if we are on 3 power, Elemental Bond is there and also Gorik's Pack Leader. And if we are on very small creatures, we can go to Soul of the Harvest effects that says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. You also have Guardian Projects that does the same thing. The only problem is these are a little bit more expensive, and the fact that they're non-token does make them less abusable. The fact that we can have Elemental Bond on the battlefield, drop a land, create a 4/4 Baloth, and draw a card is insanely busted and does come up more than you think. Now, the next thing we need to ensure is that our creatures have haste. Haste is pretty important here because we're going to make sure our creatures can tap for mana as well. So cards like Cryptolith Rite and Enduring Vitality that says creatures you control have the ability to tap and add 1 mana of any color are going to be essential here. So 4 things here. 1, we need to reduce the cost of our creatures. Then we need to ensure that our creatures have haste. After that, we need to ensure that our creatures are tapping for mana. And then finally, we need to make sure we're drawing cards whenever our creatures enter the battlefield. And that's going to set you up for this Creature Storm archetype that I'm talking about. And guys, I promise, once you pull this off, it feels amazing. You're going to be drawing a ton of cards. You're going to be taking game action after game action. And finally, you're going to end it with your massive board of creatures because remember, all of your creatures have haste. I will also mention Selvala Heart of the Wilds also just broken. This kind of circumvents the fact that you need to make all of your creatures tap for mana. If you just have enough creatures that tap for enough mana, it kind of helps you just get there as well. And since we do have haste, there are a ton of ways to bounce Selvala back to our hand, cast her again, and at that point you're kind of going infinite. So, you know, maybe less on the fun factor, but high on the broken factor, if you will. Let's talk about landfall for a little bit. We're in Temur, there's landfall decks, we're going to talk about landfall. Specifically, a way you can spice up your landfall decks with a very explosive win, because some people just flat out don't know how to win with landfall decks. Believe it or not, it's a question I get, so we're going to talk about it right now. There is a very, very busted combo in landfall decks right now, and it does take a lot of setup and a decent amount of cards to put together, so it doesn't feel that disgusting if you get it off in casual. Now, these combos center around Aftermath Analyst or Lumra. Aftermath Analyst is super simple. It's a 2 CMC card. When it enters, you get a mill 3 cards. Then you can pay 4 mana, sacrifice this creature, return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now, this is only possible because we're playing cards like Shifting Woodlands. Shifting Woodlands has Delirium. For 4 mana, Shifting Woodlands becomes a copy of target permanent card in your graveyard until end of turn. Activate only if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. So what we do here is we spend 4 mana to turn Shifting Woodlands into Aftermath Analyst, and then we spend an additional 4 mana to sacrifice our Shifting Woodlands, and while that's on the stack, we're going to sacrifice all of our lands, putting all of our lands into the battlefield, and then we're going to put all of our lands back, and guess what? Shifting Woodlands is a land, it'll come back, so we just need to make sure we're netting 8 mana on this interaction, and there's a couple different ways we can do that. We can do that with our Lotus Cobra effects that generate mana whenever a land enters, and we can do this with our Tiller Engine effects that allow us to untap lands whenever they enter the battlefield. So boom, As long as we're netting 8 mana, we're getting infinite landfall triggers. We can make this easier with Spring Heartland, Tuco, and Lumra. Lumra says 6 CMC, Vigilance, Reach, Lumra, Bellow of the Woods. Power and toughness is each equal to the number of lands you control. And then whenever Lumra enters, mill 4 cards, then return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now, how we're going to abuse this is we're going to create a token copy of Lumra whenever a land enters the battlefield. So 2 mana, make a token copy of Lumra. Lumra trigger on the stack, we can go ahead and sacrifice all of our lands with a Sylvan Safekeeper, and again, that's going to do the same thing. The lands go to the graveyard, they all come back due to the Lumra ETB, and when those lands come back, landfall triggers, again, Spring Heartland and Tuco triggers, and we can do this again. Kind of broken there. This also works with Aftermath Analyst, right? Aftermath Analyst, land enters the battlefield, we get a token copy of Aftermath Analyst, sacrifice Aftermath Analyst, and then boom. This is only 6 CMC instead of the original 8 CMC, so there's some broken landfall synergy for you guys looking for a way to end out landfall games by, comboing off. Let's end it with some value engine cards that I think are just going to be broken. Now, I'm not going to talk about Ristic Studies. You guys already know those exist. I will say Greater Good could probably just go in any teamer list, but you guys already know that as well. I will talk about Struggle for Project Purity. This is a 4 CMC enchantment that says, as Struggle for Project Purity enters the battlefield, choose Brotherhood or Enclave. You're going to choose Brotherhood every single time. It says, at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent draws a card. You draw a card for each card drawn this way. So they each get 1, you get 3. It's kind of even as far as card advantage goes, but it spreads it out amongst other opponents, and then you just get 3 cards every single turn. Kind of insane. It's a little bit of a group huggy thing, but at the same time, you're just going to get way more advantages than your opponent. And it happens on your upkeep. It doesn't happen on their upkeep. So the card they draw, they don't get to use most of the time until it gets back to their turn. So that's a little something that's in your favor as well. I'll say it, the Pride of Hallclade, underplayed. He's just underplayed. This is a Powers Matters card, kind of disguised as a Toughness Matters card, but let's read him. He's 11 CM, but don't worry because this spell is going to cost X less to cast, where X is the total toughness of creatures you control. Additionally, he has Defender, and we can pay 4 mana. And then he says, until end of turn, target creature you control gets +1, gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw cards equal to the toughness, and it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. So this is 9 times out of 10 a 1 CMC card that can draw you 15 cards. I know, I said, I just think it's super underplayed in my opinion. Throw this in your Power Matters decks. I promise you won't be disappointed. I'll also leave you with this. Not a brave take. I think Wan Shi Tong is going to be the chase card of Avatar. This is a 2 CMC legendary creature bird spirit, has flash, flying, and whenever Wan Shi Tong enters, you get to put X1/1 counters on him, then draw half X cards rounded down. Additionally, whenever an opponent searches their library, you get to put a 1/1 counter on Wan Shi Tong, and you get to draw a card. So anytime they search, you're drawing a card. This is Archivist of Ogma in a blue color that also utilizes infinite mana to draw your entire library, and also it's just a bird that grows and he has flash. Kind of does a little bit of everything. You can keep open counter magic, flash this guy in if you don't need it, and you're still getting a ton of value. You can even flash this guy in response to a tutor and get the card draw immediately. And he's also just a mana sink. Again, I think this is probably the chase card of Avatar. So if you guys open this in a pack, congratulations. With that being said, that's going to end it for the value engines.